Hi everyone. So in the last video, we had discussed the four causes of Aristotle or the Aristotelian four causes. And what we've seen is that from this perspective or framework, you could think of cause in a slightly more expansive way. So typically, a lot of people think of cause as stuff that makes some other stuff to happen. You flip a light switch and light comes on. But from this framework, we could think of cause in a more expansive way. Cause could be the stuff of which something is made, the identity or nature of the thing, or the end to which it's directed, or what it's for, or its final end, final cause, if you will. So today I wanted to focus on one of these causes, the material cause, and basically answer the question, what is matter from this philosophical perspective? So what we had mentioned when we discussed the material cause in our last video is that matter is essentially the stuff of which something is made. So a table is made of wood. A human being is made of organs, bones, neurons, synaptic vessels, neurotransmitters. And this is the level that we tend to be most comfortable with, especially in psychiatry and neuroscience. But from the Aristotelian perspective, you could miss stuff if you just simply think of matter in this somewhat limited way. And I wanted to, like I said, expand our view and introduce you into a more in-depth analysis of how you may think of matter, because I think matter is such an important part in understanding reality. So the way I think of it is, at least from the Aristotelian perspective, is I think of three properties of matter. One is that matter is the principle of individuation or the principle of individuality. The other is that matter is the principle of change, and matter is the principle of potentiality or possibility. And we're going to go into what I mean by these three factors, and this is how I think about it. So let's start with matter as a principle of individuation or the principle of individuality. I'll explain it this way. Everything you experience, anything you can imagine, or anything you can think of, is always one of two types. It's either universal or it's a individual or a particular. So it's a universal or a particular. And what do I mean by that? So what's a universal? A universal is essentially the general category of a thing. So an example would be humanity, tree, table. These are universal categories. And a particular is a specific instance of a universal. So it will be this specific person, this specific human being, for instance, Napoleon or Frederick Douglass. Or it could be this specific table of a specific height, specific color, texture, and so on. So that's the difference. So every time you experience something, an actual object or substance in the world, it's always a specific instance of some universal category. And anytime you have a thought, it's always either a specific instance or a universal itself. Once again, you could think of humanity, table tree, justice, truth, and so on. So, how does matter fit into this? From the Aristotelian framework, matter is the principle that, in a sense, converts, if you will, the universal into individuals, or rather, it splits up universals or categories into specific instances. So let me give you an example. You could have Napoleon, that's a specific human being, the specific history, specific height, weight, color, whatever. You could have Frederick Douglass. There's also a specific instance of humanity, has a specific history, specific height, weight, and so on. Now, they both share the same nature. They are both human beings. And what we would say is that the thing that makes them different is their matter, their material composition. And so you could think of matter as this thing that introduces variation into universal categories. So whenever you have a universal, matter is that principle of variation that then allows for the possibility of individuation or of the ability for there to be specific instances of that universal category. So that's one way to think of matter as the principle of individuation. I know this is counterintuitive, but I just need you to stay with me. The other way to think of matter, like I mentioned, is as a principle of change. So we've talked about how when you have a universal category, you could have variations within that category to produce individual instances of it. Now, what about when you have a substance? It is possible for a substance itself to undergo variation. Let me give you an example. So you take Napoleon, he was once a child or an infant, and then became a teenager, and then became an emperor, an adult. But in all this time, he remained Napoleon. And so, but he was undergoing change. And what we would say from this Aristotelian framework is that it is his material aspects that allows for that possibility of change, that allowed him to go from child to teenager to adult emperor and still be Napoleon. So that's the other part of matter that is the principle of change. By the way, this ability of a substance to undergo change or variation and still be the substance is a kind of change known as accidental change. So this is when a substance retains its individuality but undergoes change without losing its form, essentially. Now, when a substance loses its form or loses its nature, that's a different kind of change called substantial change. And we are going to touch on this in subsequent videos. And accidental changes involves changes in superficial features like color, texture, height, weight, and so on. But this is not a change in the substance or in the essence of the thing itself. Now, this leads us to the next point, which is that matter is the principle of potentiality or possibility. And to explain this, we need to talk about what change is from an Aristotelian perspective. The philosophical definition of change is that change is the reduction of potential or potentiality to the actual actuality. So it is when something goes from being potential to being actual that change occurs. And that is what change means in its simplest sense. And so we could talk about what potentiality and actuality is. And this is actually self-explanatory. So in this framework, every substance in a sense is a combination of actual parts and potential parts, of actualities and potentialities. So let's go back to Napoleon. So when Napoleon was an infant, he was potentially a teenager and also potentially an emperor. And when he actually became uh, a teenager or actually became an emperor, he underwent that change where the potential was reduced to the actual. And what we say is that matter is what explains the potential aspects of a substance. It is a thing that allows things to undergo change via reduction from potential to actuality. And in this sense, matter is the principle of potentiality. I know this sounds very abstract and it sounds very counterintuitive. It's not what we're used to thinking about when we think of matter, because when we think of matter, we will typically think of atoms, electrons, protons, and that's not wrong. And this view of matter actually doesn't necessarily conflict with that view. But Aristotle's view is more expansive, and it's what he, in a sense, these ideas had to be introduced for him to explain things like the phenomenon of change and to understand form, which we're going to talk about next. So, in summary, we could think of matter as the source of individuality, the ground for change, and the space for possibility. But this is not to discount our original intuitions about matter, that matter is the stuff of which things are made. And this view of matter matters because, for instance, in our field, psychiatry, neuroscience, neurology, in order to treat a brain injury, you must know what the brain is made of. But when we actually have this expansive view of matter, thinking of it as the ground of change, the space for possibility, it's very curious that although Aristotle was writing like 2000 years ago, his views are actually very modern and they sort of remind me of quantum theory, which is the most advanced, most correct scientific theory we currently have. So now we've discussed matter, that it has to do with individuation or individuality, that it has to do with change, and it has to do with potentiality. Next, we're going to talk about the flip side of matter, form, which I believe is extremely essential in understanding the human person. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.